Hello, everyone. Greetings from Paris. Thank you for joining us for the session on strengthening trust in data, participatory data ecosystems for the post-COVID society. I'm Archita Mishra, policy analyst at Paris 21 and your moderator for today's session. Paris 21 is a partnership, for those of you who don't know, hosted at the OECD, and we promote the use and production of better data and statistics for sustainable development, particularly in low and middle income countries. So welcome to the third and final day of the forum. Over the course of 2 days, we've learned a lot of things. And after 1 year since the pandemic started, we learned the different ways in which the crisis continues to reveal fractures in all aspects of our societies, including our information and data ecosystems. So we've learned that on one hand, good data offers enormous potential to create value by improving program targeting, development policy, driving economies and empowering citizens. On the other hand, the rapid datafication of the world around us that has been happening over the past several years or so has also changed the way in which citizens and individuals navigate these information ecosystems. And this is sort of marked by three big trends that I've also taken away from the discussions at the forum. One is that individuals and citizens are no longer just passive consumers of data, but can also serve as a source of vital information and are arbiters of data who can exercise active agency and rights. One of the key themes of the forums emerging has been the strong interest in the role of citizens and individuals as important data actors for a range of policy issues, such as informing, micro-planning for vaccine equity, impact monitoring, filling SDG data gaps. And at the same time, we simply don't have the tools and skills to navigate the datafied world at the scale that we need to make informed decisions. And this has huge implications on whose voices are getting included and who remains left behind. The second is that the efficacy of these programs and development policy that we talk about depends a large deal on what is the trust commanded by the underlying data and evidence and the institutions behind them. We see this reflected now with vaccine hesitancy, attitude towards climate change, or any other polarizing issues that seemingly don't seem polarizing to a lot of the experts in the evidence-based, data-driven world. And thirdly, as the data ecosystem becomes more complex, with many actors coming up in an unregulated landscape, the potential of data harms is also on the rise. We observe that data accumulation leads to a concentration of economic and political power. It raises the possibility that the data can be misused in ways that citizens can be harmed. We also see, cases of data breaches, personal data sharing scandals, and our current practices in data collection, storage, sharing has simply not kept up with the pace of these developments. Yesterday's high-level plenary on trust in data also looked at the challenges in balancing attributes of openness, quality, and privacy. All of this to say that the relationship between citizens and data systems has changed dramatically. The pandemic has simply brought forth these tensions before us. And against this background, it seems that developing participatory data ecosystems, which can be characterized by a systematic engagement of citizens in the process and all data processes really, including design and planning, production and use, can help to counter some of these tensions and trust deficits. They also present opportunities for national statistical agencies to be data stewards and trust brokers, and can be conducive to social cohesion and inclusive policymaking. But as I'm saying all of this, it almost sounds too good to be true as an antidote, because this also raises a lot of thorny questions before us. What has been the real experience of citizen engagement in data processes? What are some of the concrete elements and benefits of these democratic participatory data ecosystems? What exactly can be the role of NSOs in all of this, and what kind of data governance we need to underpin and sustain our participatory approaches? Fortunately for us, we have a brilliant lineup of panelists with us with diverse backgrounds to share their expertise with us. And before I turn to them, I invite all of us watching online or from Bern to engage with us and ask any questions throughout the session on the chat or the Q&A function. We'll be taking those up in a while. So I turn to my first panelist for the day, Rukmini S., who is an independent data journalist based in Chennai, India. Her work focuses on inequality, gender, caste, and politics. Since March 2020, she's been hosting an award-winning pandemic podcast called The Moving Curve. Her first book on whole numbers and half truths, what data and cannot tell us about modern India, is out this year. for those of you who want to engage closely with her work. Rukmini, you've been writing and reporting, speaking extensively about the COVID crisis unfolding in India and leading forums and publications. As someone who's been tracking data deficits associated with the pandemic's impact, how do you see the role of citizens in shaping the development data landscape? And could you share some examples from your experience of this period? Thank you.
Thank you, Archita. I'd like to begin by thanking you, the Paris 21 team, and the UN World Data Forum for having me on this panel. I'm looking forward to sharing my thoughts, but even more than that, to hearing from the other wonderful speakers that I'm happy to be sharing space with. The relationship between journalists and governments and establishments is typically adversarial, and I would have it no other way. If the press corps of a democracy is ever described as well-behaved, then that should lead to introspection. But today I come in peace, not just to honor the objectives of this forum, but also because just as I believe that a blanket suspicion of numbers rather than skepticism is harmful for a democracy, I also believe that there is a role both for cooperation and scrutiny between citizens and governments, and having just one or the other can be harmful. Next slide, please.
We don't see anything.
The relationship, sorry. Yes, India's data deficits, in a sense, have been laid bare during the pandemic. The sheer scale of the second wave in particular, next slide, please. The sheer scale of the second wave in particular in India left no place for anyone or anything to hide anymore. But not all of these data deficits are new. India went into the pandemic with an underdeveloped health surveillance as well as death registration mechanism, and this then had an impact on COVID data collection. Being as heterogeneous as it is, including in terms of state capacity, also means that regions within the country that are better able to tackle health crises might also be able to better report numbers. And this creates a skewed sense in public perception of areas that are doing better or worse. Overall, what we ended up having is one, a lack of adequate aggregation and public sharing of data by the government, which I'll talk about in a minute, and clear undercounts in other cases, particularly in the case of COVID death data reporting. There have been a number of citizen initiatives that have sprung up to help address some of these data gaps, but I'd like to mention 3 of them in particular, 2 national and 1 hyperlocal. The first is an initiative where data was available publicly, but the aggregation has been done by citizens. The biggest problem that we have had in India for health surveillance data during the pandemic is a lack of uniformity. From the beginning of the pandemic right until now, each of India's 36 states and union territories report new updates of COVID data in their own formats. These range from dashboards to PDFs to images that are shared on WhatsApp groups of journalists to mayors sharing data on their Twitter handles. There were no national guidelines on a fixed reporting format, and so states have done as best as they can. There is also no rule on how granular the data needs to be. So in the first few months of 2020, a group of young Indian volunteers came together on the Telegram app and began to collate all of these disparate streams of data. They then standardized this reporting structure and built a GitHub repository, and finally a front-end dashboard as well as an API for the data. This website, covid19india.org, has been run for 22 months by this group now on a no-cost basis, completely anonymously. They have declined all recognition and money in the interest of being purely public-spirited. covid19india.org is now India's only source of disaggregated COVID data. The government's own website does not carry historical data, does not have subnational data, and does not have an API. This group is truly inspiring, but it raises 2 important questions for our broader discussion. One is, how long can such citizen-led initiatives sustain themselves? A lot of the data entry and checks and balances is still manual, and the group is now completely burnt out. They are winding up operations at the end of the month, and so I am now involved with another effort of volunteers to take the baton from them. But how long will our group sustain itself? I can't say. 2, when citizens come together to take on a role that in almost every other country the government is doing, does it strengthen or weaken democracy? If this group had not come together, our understanding of the pandemic would have suffered. But would it have created more democratic pressure on the elected government to put out this data themselves? That's something else I'd like you to consider, but I don't have an answer to yet. Next slide, please. The second initiative we have is hyperlocal and is a case of citizens generating their own data to perform a watchdog function. Dr. Arun N. Madhavan is a doctor of internal medicine who runs a small clinic in Palakkad, which is in the southern Indian state of Kerala. As with elsewhere in the country, it was evident to Dr. Madhavan and others in Kerala that the official death count did not seem to reflect what they were seeing on the ground. So Dr. Madhavan led a team of volunteers again who scanned the state's media for news reports and obituaries that mentioned a death from COVID and cross-referenced it against the state's official list. By November 2020, they said that 45% of the deaths that they had tallied never showed up in the government's list. But by early 2021, the group had to stop their watchdog work because most of the media had moved on and had stopped publishing local news or obituaries. So again, this is a novel initiative, but raises questions about sustainability of such initiatives. Next slide, please. The last initiative I'd like to talk about is something I was involved in. And here the journalist as citizen performed a more traditional journalistic role, which is to out data that existed but wasn't being shared with the public. During India's second wave, journalists who knew their cities well began to push back against the official death tolls because they could see from crematoria and burial grounds that the numbers of deaths they were seeing were several times the numbers that were being officially reported. So one way of reporting the true toll from COVID or approaching the true toll from COVID is from excess mortality, as we've seen in the UK, South Africa, Peru. While India collects this data every day, it isn't made public and it is typically released in a PDF 2 years down the line. So by developing sources in 3 Indian states, I was able to access this official all-cause data, and it showed that that in the state of Madhya Pradesh, for example, the relatively poor, large state in the center of the country, deaths from all causes were 5 times their usual value in May 2021, and excess mortality up to May was 40 times the official COVID death toll for the same time. Subsequently, journalists across the country have done similar work in other states. And what we now have is something closer to a national estimate of what missed COVID data could be. So these are 3 citizen-led initiatives from India's pandemic experience that I think contributed significantly to our understanding of the pandemic. Archita?
Thanks so much, Rukmini, for the fantastic stories at different levels, and also raising the really important questions on sustenance as well as the impact on democracy. Speaking of which, I think this is a great time for us to head into the next presentation, which can perhaps shed light on some of the questions that you also raised. So our next speaker is Professor Julia Lane, who's the co-founder and director of the Coleridge Initiative and a professor at the New York University's Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. She brings us a wealth of experience from her time from US Census Bureau and among various other institutions. Her latest book, Democratizing Our Data, is a wake-up call to sort of fix our broken public data infrastructures and engage with citizens also meaningfully. Julia, while reading your book, I had a sense of urgency that we've all sort of known long ago that well-oiled public data systems are needed for democracies to function properly. But could you also tell us why there is a need to look inward and demystify and democratize statistical systems themselves? What is the real value in this democratization? You could also unpack some of the elements that this concept entails. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks for that very interesting introduction, Rukmini. That was essentially encapsulating many of the issues I raised in my book. If you could go to the next slide. So kind of what's the problem? Oh, it looks like you've turned this into a PDF. I had this animated. Okay, that's fine. So here's the problem, and I want to talk a little bit about what the issue is, and then talk about how to solve it. So again, foreshadowing what Rukmini said, in the collection of weather data, and I talked about this in the plenary yesterday, we can learn a lot. So it used to be that the data on weather was collected in Washington, D.C., and the weather forecast came out essentially in Washington. And the result of that, this is over 100 years ago, was that one example, that when the hurricane was heading towards Texas, the federal government said, no, it's actually it's heading towards Florida. So because the information and the data weren't there, over 6,000 Americans were killed. And after that, what they did was they restructured the way in which data were collected and used, and they pushed the information about data out to the local areas. And we now have hourly information on rain and wind and, all kinds of locally generated information. I was in Sacramento a month ago. They had air quality indicators because obviously they worry a lot about the smoke there. Locally generated, locally relevant data that is produced in a way that local people understand and use, and locally contributed information. So I am very much inspired by that, because what that does is we could imagine having, in addition to having federal official statistics, I'm sorry I keep using the US example, but that's what I know, so that's what I'm going to talk about. Having local measures of unemployment, local measures of economic activity that are generated on the ground, just like temperature and weather information is generated. The reason that that's important is, if you think about what people care about, other than the Federal Reserve and national policymakers, people care about what's happening for unemployment and economic activity that affects them. And that's the way in which data can get democratized. It provides a way of developing data and information that help allocate resources, that help address policy issues. At the end of the day, all of those are local. And the example that I've cut and pasted here, actually, when I started writing the book, I thought I was the only one who cared about this. But it turns out more and more people are starting to say, our national measures are not making sense. Our national statistical systems are not working. And, here we are finding it the same case in India, not just in the United States. So why does that matter? Well, kind of the fundamental thing that societies and civilizations do is count and measure. And if we lose trust in the way in which we understand how activity, health, economic, social activity is measured, we lose trust in many of the foundations of a democratic system. So if you go to the next slide, what's started to happen and what we've been building in the US is building bottom-up driven approaches. So the challenges is you've got great things happening, the great assets with the federal statistical system, which is the quality of the data and the longitudinal consistency and so on, but they don't understand what the local measures are. So how can we build a system that has the best of the statistical system and the best of the local measures? And so a set of states, and we started with the Midwest, but now it's the South and the East, hope for the West, from the West eventually, but developing products at a decentralized level that address issues that are of interest to the local areas. So obviously unemployment to re-employment. The challenge with the national unemployment statistics, we don't have granular data, we don't have data by race and by education, and so we don't understand the inequities. What the states have started to do is build new measures from administrative data that then can be tested and checked. The point here is, and you can see the example here, but the data produced every week and provided to the governors and to the workforce boards and to the citizens for double testing. So this is an example of creating new measures, getting them to have value. And that's, once you have value, then you have buy-in and you have sustainability. So getting the support so that this isn't just a one-off, as you were talking about COVID, but talking about products that can be produced that have value and have sustainability. Last slide. So one question is how can you develop systems that that are democratized, but that don't rely so much on manual reporting? So one of the things that we have been building over the past 5 years, and that is turning out to be super successful, is I was struck by, again, this, I feel like I was set up with the India example. Why would you have to manually look at newspapers? Why can't you build tools, AI, machine learning, and natural language processing tools to read the text, to pull out information about data? So I'm going to encourage you to go to our website and take a look at the Show Us the Data conference that we're having on October 20th. But what we have is open source machine learning tools. We ran a competition, and what you can do is find out how data are being used and for what topic, and who are the experts who are referring to them. So you build a community around the data that is open and democratized. So AI can be used for bad, it can also be used for good. So for example, here is an example, people are very worried about, I'm closing with the example of a hurricane. I opened with the example of a hurricane. How could we find out what data can be used to look at hurricanes? We've been working with NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, as well as starting to work with FEMA, the Emergency Management System, to use AI to read 80 million text documents. And with those text documents, you find out what data are used and for what topics. And so this is an example of a word cloud, but obviously an API is being built that combines the documents and the data, and you can automatically check how the data are being used for what results. And since that's open, people can correct it. So that's how you can democratize data using new tools, technologies, and engaging a community. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Julia. That was a fascinating presentation, and I particularly liked how you started with this historical shock that transformed the way in which a certain data was collected and made locally relevant and owned and mainstreamed into as a state-driven processes. However, this also raises a lot of questions in terms of what are some of the prerequisites in terms of baseline capacity that you're looking at for instance, leveraging new tools and technologies for this to make it possible. And the example that you showed for linking administrative data systems, for instance, may or may not be at a viable starting point in many other countries. We'll come back to that in a bit, but I'll turn to our next speaker who can provide us perhaps a bit more context from another part of the world. So my next speaker is McDonald Obudo, who's the Director General of the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, who brings with us over 2 decades of experience with the NSO and who has been a champion for continuous improvements of statistical operations to address the challenges brought on by the new data ecosystem. He was also honored recently with the prestigious State Award in light of his exemplary leadership in the 2019 Kenya Population and Housing Census. McDonald KNBS has recently embarked on this journey with multiple partners, including Paris 21, to include citizen-generated data in its operations. So in this regard, the NSO has pioneered some participatory approaches in engaging with civil society organizations and other community members across the data lifecycle. So we're keen to hear your perspective and how that would complement, for instance, stories from India and the US. On how this journey has been so far and what are some of the benefits and challenges that you've encountered in this process, and most importantly, how you see the role of KNBS as a trusted partner or broker for such an engagement. So over to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Madam Machita, for the introduction, and thank you so much, my colleague panelist, and all those who are listening to this conversation. As has been said, the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics has taken some steps to really try to use the data that is generated from the non-traditional source, particularly when it comes to the government setting. And this is so because we have noted that there are a number of SDG indicators that cannot really be reported based on what we have collected. And so we need to look at the other way of really getting that kind of information. The same applies to the fact that as a Bureau of Statistics, we are expected, or people assume that we have all sorts of data, and so researchers and students particularly would ask for data which we do not have, and yet it could be sitting somewhere, so we are not able to provide that kind of information, and yet maybe it is somewhere else. It's only that we have not known, or we have not interacted with the data in a way that we can authenticate it as official statistics. So then of course, with the COVID-19 hitting the world, our data collection approach had to change, and in the process of changing, we noted that it was not possible to collect as much as we used to do, and so that then brought us to the feeling that we need to look for other ways of doing this. So there is a real need to get the to get the granular data, and also reprocess some of the data that we have to promote the uptake of and impact of the statistics. Now, there is also need to harness the alternative sources of data, and here I have in mind the citizen-generated data and also the big data that could also help in filling the existing data gaps. It might not be complete, but at least a number of data gaps would be managed if this kind of two approaches are properly utilized. So to this end, there are some steps that we have taken as a Bureau of Statistics to operationalize the use of CGD data, so that we are able to report them officially or as official statistics. And this is an area where we have been working very closely with Paris 21 and a number of partners. GPS DD has been involved in this process also. So then, in this case, then our conversation in this area of the big data is also ongoing, but we are using a different approach from what we have in the CGD data. So now, to actualize this process, we have had the participation of the civil society organizations, being members of our statistical technical working committees. In our Statistics Act, we have the provision to come up with the sectoral technical working committees for statistics. And so of late, we have been incorporating a number of CSOs to be part of that, because we realize that there is a lot of data that they're generating, which we do not have, and we could go through some of the processes to really have them as official statistics. Of course, there is a scrutiny that we do at the end of it all that maybe I'll be able to share something on that. So we have also allowed the CSOs to use our sampling frame, and also we provide them with technical advice in terms of conducting their studies. Here you note that the Bureau has very elaborate statistical frames which are not easy to be developed by any single CSO or other bodies, because that is not within their mandate. So we have been able to really share what we have, so that when they generate the data, we will be able to go through some processes and have them as official statistics that can also help in bridging the gaps. So the participation of KNBS, the CSOs, the NGO board coordination, and a number of other development partners in training on the CGD has been done. We have had one very good meeting where our retreat or workshop that we have shared quite a lot. And in this case, we even came up with the criteria of validating the CGD. In this case, what we did was to come up with 8-point criteria, which would be able to help us in ensuring that we have quality statistics. From, of course, what is known as a requirement for the quality statistics, where we are talking of the relevance, the accuracy, timeliness and punctuality, accessibility of the data, interpretability and clarity of data, then credibility of that data, including coherence and consistency as elements of data quality. We look at all those aspects and also look at the methodology that has been used, how sound it is, so that we break them down into 3 components. For each criteria, we have high, medium, and not acceptable, so that using that, we are able now to gauge what is coming from the NSO, the CSOs, so that it can now help in getting to determine that what has been produced is of good quality that can be used or not. So that is one thing that the retreat really helped us to come up with. And in the process, we had a number of presentations where the civil society organizations that are producing data were able to make presentations to us and show us exactly what they have been doing or what they have next. So then we were also asked about the strengths and weaknesses in terms of this kind of participatory approach. I'm happy to really note that there are a number of strengths. One is we have a very good legal, we have the Statistics Act, which provides us with the legal framework for undertaking our statistics in the country. So KNBS being the principal agency for the government in terms of data collection, analysis, and dissemination of official statistics, then we in our act, it provides for a number of areas that would allow us to really collaborate with any other bodies that are producing statistics, because in the act it allows us to be responsible for planning, authorizing, coordinating, and supervising all the official statistics that are happening within the national statistical system. It also allows us to provide use of the best practices and methods in the production and dissemination of official statistics. It is also giving us room to really collaborate and assist any other institutions in the production of official statistics. And beyond that, there is also the promoting coordination among producers, users, and suppliers of official statistics, so that we are able to have committees that would be championing various kinds of statistics that we are producing in different sectors. And of course, then the other bit, which we are also drawing from our legal document, which is the Act, is designating statistics produced by National Statistical System as official statistics on being satisfied that the necessary criteria have been followed. So all these are actually giving us a very, very strong backing in undertaking this kind of approach where we are able to use the citizen-generated data. So in that case, then we offer support from, we have support from various stakeholders, and then we also have a number of potential data producers by the non-state actors. And then we also have a number of opportunities in terms of partnership with the non-state actors, as we have already demonstrated through the meetings that we have had. And of course, we are continuing that process to ensure that really this venture is taken to the full length. And this process also acts as a vehicle for statistical advisory, advocacy, and capacity building. We learn from each other. We are able to train. We are able to share our experiences, and that then gives us an opportunity to ensure that what we produce would be of good quality for use, particularly what is coming from the non-state actors. Then, of course, from the Act, we have that opportunity to steward the data quality. It is also part of our mandate, really, it is part of our vision and mission to ensure that the data the statistics that is produced is of high quality. And of course, it links the producer to the user very, very directly. This is one thing that we have also demonstrated. And it enhances the confidence of the public in statistics, so that they can have very good use of that. You know, when you share and you are able to show how the data has been generated, both by government and state actors, then it enhances the usability of such kind of statistics, because the confidence really goes up. And of course, then on this, it also enhances the resilience of the national statistical system to the shocks in production of statistics. I gave an example of when COVID-19 came, and we were really struggling to get how to collect data, because then we could not do it face-to-face. Our frame was not supporting a case where you are to do the data collection remotely. So we really had to quickly change to some of these techniques. And of course, we are also asked to mention about some of the challenges that we face with this. Of course, we are not going very far, but there are challenges that are really eminent. One of them is the differences in the institutional arrangements. Then we have the need for consideration in the legal frameworks. Of course, for our act, so far we are okay, and we revised our act in 2019. But of course, anytime that changes occur, we have major changes that require the act to be revised, we will be able to do so. But because we are collaborating with other institutions, then our legal frameworks would really need to be compatible for us to work together. And this is one area that we really have to work on. And then there's also the significant requirement in human and financial resources. We take note that a lot of resources are required from time to time, and in this case, it is one of the challenges that we would be facing to really deal with, including the concern that not all non-state actors would have statisticians, economists, or some of the personalities that can handle statistics. So we really have to keep on doing the capacity building. Now, on the role of KNBS in sustaining participatory approach, we identify the existing data gaps and link them to the available CGD data. And we also design modalities for collaboration with the non-state actors and relevant stakeholders for those who are producing dealing with the CGD. Then there is also the coordination, coordinate the development of the technical working committee on the CGD and monitoring its operations. And as I mentioned, we provide technical advice and continuous capacity building for non-state actors for them now to really conform to what is expected of the standard. And of course, this also comes with the stewardship to the quality of statistics that we produce, both of us would produce. So basically, that is what we have done so far. Thank you so much, Madam Achita, for giving me the chance.
Thank you so much, Mr. McDonald, for giving us your perspective and showing how a proactive approach from the National Statistical Office can itself make so much of a difference in integrating data sourced from citizens and making the processes, intermediary processes, also participatory, given a lot of the quality considerations that you raised. A lot of the presentations so far have sort of hinted at this, but I think in the final panelists would really own into this topic, which is the different instruments and mechanisms of data governance that underpin, the possibility even of involving and engaging with different actors, including citizens and community representatives. So for that, I'll turn to Malar Veerappan, who is a senior data scientist and program manager at the World Bank. She works on large data initiatives with focus on building systems that have global reach and impact. She works with countries and organizations to find solutions that they use data and technology to solve big development problems. And more recently, she also served as the project manager for the 2021 World Development Report. One of the core issues that underpins the narrative of this report was the importance of building trustworthy data ecosystems through collective action and multi-stakeholder data governance. So, Malar, could you tell us a little bit more about that, and in what ways do current frameworks and arrangements, as McDonald put it, to govern data responsibly fall inadequate to realize the benefits from these participatory approaches? And could you also give us examples of some models that have worked and provide some answers to scaling up some of this work? And maybe also you can end with, what do you see as the role of development partners and, big international organizations to reform the status quo in this? Thank you.
Thanks, Archita, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I'll try and cover some of the very difficult questions that you posed. What I'll do is I'll start with a little bit of introduction to how we define data governance, how we've approached data governance frameworks in the recently launched World Development Report. So, with the explosion of data, we're all seeing how countries are struggling to balance the use of data with the need to safeguard against harmful misuse of such data. A lot of this particularly came to sort of international spotlight during the recent COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to that, we're also seeing increasing global data inequalities, which can further exclude poor people and marginalized groups who actually stand to benefit more from the value derived from data. So to address all of these concerns and challenges, in the report, we present the data governance framework as a series of 4 layers, as you see in the slide here. But what I will focus in today's discussions particularly is the institutional ecosystem, which is really important because how we design now the institutional ecosystem that caters kind of to this new data economy that's surfacing is quite important. And I think that's where how we integrate the multi-stakeholder, what we call multi-stakeholder data governance or participatory data governance approaches, where we include more people in how we deliberate around the decisions we take around data governance becomes particularly important. One of the things also that in the report, what we tried to do was to, what we recognized is also that typically organizations look at, data, the decisions around data within the realm of data management, which kind of remains in this, boundaries of designing technical rules about how data should be collected, processed, shared, and disposed across the data lifecycle. But now in practical terms, we're recognizing the need for these data governance functions, which is more about designing and implementing the norms, rules, the infrastructure, and institutions that will shape the way stakeholders in the data system collect, use, and share data in the way that it compiles with what we've defined as the principles of the social contract for data, which is value, trust, and equity. So what, again, this means is that data management functions or decisions about how data are these functions are, the data management functions are executed is done by different actors in different contexts, but without a whole of government approach, which is where these data governance functions come into play. There's a lot of risk of providing inconsistent standards, data silos, and going forward, we need to work on these data governance functions so we're able to unpack and provide more consistent guidance. So one of the examples I like to point out here is the project that the Understanding Patient Data Initiative is undertaking in UK, and they call it learning data governance. I thought it was very appropriate. The way they look at it is that you have constant feedback loops that are built into how data governance is approached by the government agencies, where there's a constant feedback loop into how data are used. You're measuring the outcomes of how the data that's been how access has been provisioned to the data. So this is to me it's really interesting as to how different stakeholders are experimenting about how these data governance frameworks need to be designed. So here I'll provide a very quick sort of snapshot of how we've organized some of the data governance functions. We've intentionally taken a step back, and we didn't kind of advocate for specific institutions because that would change, and there's no one size fits all approach to that. And that would really depend on the country context, but we kind of identified a few functions. And I won't go into detail here, but maybe I'll highlight a few. For example, if governments in most cases lead many of the data governance functions, but non-governmental stakeholders like private sector, civil society, academia, think tanks can still play important roles in shaping the process and outcome of each function. The private sector and civil society, for example, can contribute to co-regulation or consultative rulemaking initiatives to influence the design of strategies, policies, even laws and regulations. And again, when it comes to technical standards such as interoperability of data systems, the private sector and technical NGOs can play a much more active role than government, given their expertise. Through their research and advocacy for efforts, academia and civil society organizations again play a critical role in influencing how these functions are designed to promote learning and accountability by raising awareness of new policy issues and risks. I think that's why the example that Rukmani presented in the beginning was really fascinating, the role they played in sort of highlighting some of those issues in the way that she presented it. Again, for all of these stakeholders actually to be able to play this role effectively, they need to be empowered to do so. And taking a multi-stakeholder approach helps design this data governance frameworks in a way that they are inclusive, legitimate, and then it can engender trust in the way that the data are used. Before I move on into more specific examples of multi-stakeholder governance or participatory approach, I'm going to kind of loosely use those terms interchangeably. I wanted to present here some data that we gathered for the purposes of the report, that despite the increasing importance of some of the key institutions, such as data governance entities, these are entities that our governments are setting up now to kind of provide this whole of government approach to data governance. Data protection authorities and cybersecurity agencies, they're not very common in low and income countries. So if you look here at the chart at the left side, only 29% of low income countries have, on the right side, you see that only 29% of low income countries have established data protection authorities compared to 82% of high income countries. Similarly, cybersecurity agencies are relatively widespread in middle and high income countries, but are present only in 26% of low income countries. Again, on the left side, you see the statistics on the data governance entities. But the point I want to make here is some of these institutions are still very critical, especially when we talk about trust. I think one of the dimensions of trust is protecting the integrity of the data, and having these institutions that are designing these regulations or providing the infrastructure to protect against some of the threats of against data becomes really important. Again, irrespective of the institutional design, again, which will vary according to a country context, we highlight that there are certain features of the institutions. It can be any institution, whether it's a governmental institution or an NGO or a private sector. there are a few features that we find that are really critical to ensuring that, that goes a long way in governing data effectively. I won't go into all of these. I think you can see them on the slides. I'll point to maybe two that are really important and that kind of brings in the spirit of multi-stakeholder governance. One is transparency. Basically, but in order for participants to have to meaningfully engage in these multi-stakeholder discussions or participatory processes, I think the process has to be transparent. In order for you to build trust, there has to be accountability mechanisms, which is what some of the institutions like what I talked about, the Understanding Patient Data Initiative does, is by being more, by providing more information about the outcomes of how data has been used, the data that's been shared, and being transparent about it, you're able to engender more trust in the process. The other important sort of feature is data literacy. Again, for meaningful participation, I think stakeholders need to become more data literate. What that means is they have a better understanding of the different issues, at least even within the context of what they're engaging. I think these become particularly important, and there are others, which is the other one. Maybe I'll just quickly point out is coordination. So now I'll probably present like 3 examples of multi-stakeholder partnerships, which have really provided great value. Here is an example of where a Sinhalese think tank initiative, IPAR, through their aggregator project, found out that there are several organizations that were producing data independently without interacting. It included both government and non-governmental organizations. And one of the, and what they did was they brought together all these stakeholders to understand who was doing what and which data was available where in previously sort of, siloed context. And then after having a better understanding, they were able to bring together collaboration structures and sort of prevent any misunderstanding that was on leadership or ownership more in terms of who owns the agenda sort of perspective. But the point again I wanted to make here is the value that this sort of bringing together different multiple stakeholders together here, even if it was by the think tank. They were able to unlock a lot of the data that otherwise, kind of sat in different parts of, in the hands of different stakeholders. And it unlocked and provided this really valuable set of data that's now being used for policy making. So another point I'll say here is that, especially such sector-specific initiatives can demonstrate, the value of multi-stakeholder participatory approaches much more quickly than much broader initiatives. So again, this is also another example that it doesn't have to always be led by public sector, but government buy-in does become critical for sustainability, of course. The example here is about how Barcelona, as part of the Decode initiative, is done this experimental project to see how they can unlock the use of data that is captured from Internet of Things or IoT devices. The reason I wanted to bring this example to the presentation is, data governance specifically in the context of smart cities. I mean, we talk about high frequency data, but the extent of higher frequency data that these IoT devices are much more exponential and smart. And I think all of us know that, smart cities is becoming, again, something that because of urbanization, there's going to be a lot of uptake on how we're using IoT devices in the context of development of smart cities. So data governance in this context is going to be particularly important. And in this case specifically, I think having a more purpose-driven approach, and that's something that is adapted to the local context, it becomes really important. And in this case, another important point I think to note is that this has a society-wide impact in comparison to the previous example that we talked about. So here, the participatory bottom-up sort of data governance approach would be really important to ensure that you are you're involving a wide variety of input from the different types of stakeholders, because here the incentives and views could be quite diverse.
Thanks, Malar. Sorry to cut you a bit.
Sure, no problem. I can come back to the last example if it's taking too much of your time. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Yeah. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I realize.
Sure, no problem. Yeah.
And we have received a whole lot of questions from the audience that I would like to sort of bring in front of us. So there's something that someone has asked, and I think Malar, it was also alluded in your presentation about how sectoral specific initiatives vis-a-vis bigger initiatives have differential impacts on participatory approaches. And so someone has put this question to Professor Lay indirectly, and it says, I see a lot of promise in pushing data collection and testing out to the local level, but there are real advantages that come from centralizing these processes. So there's a one-stop shop from government services. So can you explain when is the bottom-up approach better and when it falls short compared to the centralized top-down? So really thinking about the different spectrum of participatory approaches and, when does it work? Maybe in a minute if possible.
I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both and. So you absolutely need a statistical system for the quality and the longitudinal consistency. But what's been amazing about this conversation is how much I've never met any of these great panelists before, but we're all thinking along the same lines. You've got to have the bottom up. Because you've got to understand how the data are being generated. You've got to understand, it's got to be a transparent process, and there's got to be accountability. None of that happens in a statistical agency. There's no accountability, there's no transparency, and there's no co-determination of what gets produced. So I think the two together are critical.
Wow, that was a rather provocative response. Yep. but this is why we're having this conversation.
That's right.
So much. And there's one other question that can perhaps be relevant for Rukmini, which is about there was for citizen-generated initiatives to have some impact. There's already sort of a data culture that might be present, in the context of India that you were talking about. So how can we really connect ordinary people to these urgent needs to better govern data when we're talking about, basic data literacy, and what do you see your role as a data journalist in sort of bridging the gap that you've seen? Thanks.
So you're absolutely right about that, which is that this community predated the pandemic and has existed for some years now. And it's existed in a pretty organic fashion, not something that has been sort of curated by or done very intentionally by the government to, involve people. No, it's a sort of public spirited community of people who might have day jobs with a, a company that, like an IT company or something, but who are just deeply invested in open data. And I think one of the things that that happens is that the people who are working on this might not always have the skills that we're talking about, the AI skills that Professor Lane is talking about, for example. But one of the things that we've seen in the data community in India is this great public spiritedness. So despite the fact that many of us journalists don't have these technical skills, we find people willing to, scrape municipal corporation websites, put up the data in a GitHub and share it with us. And I think one of the lessons from COVID-19india.org's work too is to have a sort of open data and data community sharing perspective or attitude in peace times as well. It built on a community that has existed in the past, and we are already, we're beginning to talk about the next pandemic, but I don't think that's the only direction that data needs to go, and we need to talk about the next all sorts of challenges that an open data community should think about. So yes, sharing skills across from people who might have it to users who might not in peace times, and coming in with an attitude of releasing, really wanting to liberate the data. That's something that's really helped India, I think.
Thanks so much, Rukmini. And I think I will turn to Malar maybe for sort of a few words maybe on what she thinks that, how development partners can really play a role in this debate, because I think that's not really been emphasized so far. And also there's a question in the audience that says, how can we make sure that when the communities, the data from communities is being collected and harvested, how is that really incorporated in the decision in the pipeline upstream? How do we keep track of that? Are we measuring that? And what can we do to really make sure that the feedback is somewhat incorporated once, and the benefits flow back to the communities. So the participatory approach really has a close feedback loop, like you had mentioned in the example from UK.
Sure, Archita. So I think like Julia Lane said, that I think we're all thinking about how do we respond to these new type of challenges. And I think some of the places where development partners can play a role, and this is something we're thinking about, is how do we promote this notion of participatory approach and multi-stakeholder governance in the work we do with countries or with our other partners, IGOs, because we've been talking about a lot of this conceptually, and in some cases, like the examples that I talked about, and also another example that Ada Lovelace Institute did was setting up this biometric council, to provide recommendations of how, the challenges and how facial recognition data should be used. So I think this is more about, continuing to sort of unpack what this means in reality. How can you really build these systems? And also sort of, again, promoting more experimental third-party kind of setups like data trusts and data intermediaries who probably can build more, the accountability mechanisms better. And to Rukmini's point, so it doesn't have to just be about protecting data, but it should be something that enables better data sharing, that looks at openness. The third one is also about converting that data into information that actually can be used. I'll just very quickly note on the last point about how do we keep this communication with the people about whom the data is being collected? And again, that's a big area that, it's a constant sort of, work in progress. There are several initiatives that are, trying to experiment again through data councils, data assemblies, civic meetings. And you got to kind of, this is where I think purpose-driven becomes important, because you want to kind of decide there's only so many people you can engage, right? There's always a balance, and what kind of representation you bring in becomes important. And some of these initiatives are also building a more transparent way of publishing the outcomes from these discussions, or what was decided initially as to how the data will be used. And they're trying to track in reality, how the project has progressed.
Thanks so much, Malar. And I would also then finally bring in Mr. McDonald-Ubodo for his last words on this, and maybe sort of addressing, we've talked about the importance of having participatory approaches. We've seen some pioneering work from your organization, but then there's also a lot of challenges and a long road to travel to get there. Maybe a good note to end here would be to think about, what if we didn't do this at all? What are the costs, and what if we don't change the status quo from the perspective of an NSO? Given all of the hurdles, how do you think, where do we stand to lose if we don't embark on this open participatory approach? So maybe from your perspective, Mr. Ubodo, some final words. Thank you.
Thank you so much again for the chance. Really, if the status quo is to remain, I think we lose a lot, because we are in the era where resources are also very limited, particularly in the government. And so it means the kind of the volume of statistics, the data that we've been generating might not be exactly the same. And so we would really need to leverage on what is coming from these other non-state actors through the CGD, because if it means then we are still going to have a lot of data gaps. Remember, I started by saying that we are not able to report on all the SDG indicators. And so there is need to still look for ways of doing so. You know, having a process that has been scientifically done would really give something. It does not mean that it has to come from the government. So we are really championing for this to ensure that we are able to respond to a lot of data needs. And the data needs keep on increasing with the time. You know, as you do good dissemination, as you interact, many people get to learn what is in existence, and so they would always demand for more. This is one way that will be able to keep us in business to ensure that we are able to provide for what our users would require. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I apologize to our audience members 5 minutes over time, and also our panelists for the same. But thank you so much for all the fascinating interventions. I still have a lot of unanswered questions from the audience, which I will relay back to the panelists, and maybe we can come back on the chat and sort of respond to some of those in a centralized manner. But thanks so much again to everyone for taking the time in Bern on a Wednesday morning and engaging with us on this really complex issue. At Paris 21, we've just started this work to understand and apply participatory mechanisms in our pilot work and some of our knowledge products. So a lot of these conversations will feed there and shape our future work in this area. And a final word of thanks also to colleagues from the technical support staff and the secretariat for being with us and helping us with the platform. And I wish you all a great last day of the forum. Thank you so much. Cheers. Bye.